Thank you. Yep. Hello, everybody, and once again, I thank Professor Dietmar and UC Berkeley to invite me to come to this beautiful campus in a beautiful time to this very important and timely conference that to be side by side with so many distinguished participants of the conference and. It is my new research that I have just started working on, which is the political economy of U.S.-China relation in the bigger context of U.S. and China's foreign policy at large after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so speaking of the new Asian disorder that we might want to ask, and it is a new Asian disorder in contrast to what? And it reminds us of a kind of a phrase that is popular in the 1990s that many people forgot about, is this New World Order that that George W.H. Bush and first talked about after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is a world perceived to be a Pax Americana. Soviet Union is gone, and of course we have got Francis Fukuyama wrote that very famous book, that the end of history and the last man, that allowed the whole world realize that there's no alternative, that everyone is converging towards a liberal democracy and free market economy. So it is this kind of a heyday of the so-called New World Order, Pax Americana, in the 1990s, and in more specific terms, that this New World Order is underlined by two processes, that is the globalization and democratization, and it led to and at that time there was a literature on the third wave of democratization. After the end of Cold War, US no longer lead to support that anti-communist dictators, so a lot of US allies democratized, starting in the 1980s from the Philippines, and liberalization starting to progress in Taiwan and South Korea and many other places. And of course, after the collapse of communism, we've got the democratization of Eastern Europe, or at least apparent democratization of Russia under Yeltsin, and it didn't work out in the end. But in the 1990s, it's this kind of atmosphere of optimism, of globalization and democratization. And these two are actually linked, that there is some research showing that democratization or the promotion of democracy project of the U.S. Marked by the establishment of the National Endowment for Democracy in the Reagan administration, it has a value component, but some research to show that actually there is a component that democratization actually help promote free trade and opening of these other countries' economy to foreign capital, particularly U.S. capital. So there's a link between democratization and globalization, and actually there's kind of empirical political science research showing that there's a positive correlation. Some like I don't have time to go into detail, but it's in the paper that there's a quantitatively country that is under a democratic regime is more open to foreign capital investment, more open to free trade, and so on and so forth. So there's a relation between the two projects, that is the promotion of democratization and promotion of globalization. And in terms of globalization, that US is definitely taking the lead. I have to skip all these slides because of the limit of time, but just highlights some of the graph that since the 70s and actually since the 80s, US has been driving globalization in two different ways. One is that U.S. is becoming the largest capital exporter to the world, that U.S. investment going to the world. And so the U.S. agenda is to promote globalization, meaning that they knock on doors of other countries that give up the protectionist policy and open your economy for U.S. capital, either in the form of FDI or in the form of financial portfolio investment. At the same time, U.S. actually is becoming the biggest trade deficit countries in the world, while many other major economies, Germany, Japan, and later on China, is becoming a huge surplus country. So the whole process of globalization is driven by the process in which U.S. asks different countries to give up protectionist policy, open up themselves for U.S. and other foreign capital. In exchange, U.S. is opening up U.S. market for the goods from these countries. So it is the game of globalization. And again, I don't have time to go into detail, but it is only possible under the U.S. dollar hegemonic status in the world economy. And so it is the globalization project. That is, you compare cross-sectionally, that you will see that all major economy of the world, that U.S. is the biggest deficit country that suck in commodities and manufactured products from around the world, while most other major economy, China, Germany, Korea, and Japan, and they are surplus country, meaning that they are exporting more than they import. So for this moment, that we can say that when Trump came along and saying that U.S. is no longer open to free trade, and there's a lot of new tariff against foreign products, and there's a talk about U.S. is withdrawing from globalization, and then Xi Jinping in Davos recently talked about that China is very ready to become the kind of a power that safeguards the world free trade, and there's a lot of talk about whether China is going to replace the U.S. as the new leader of globalization. And after Trump was elected, that Washington Post and a lot of commentators like Fareed Zakaria talk about that Trump election is the biggest present to China, because when U.S. retreat from the global economy and the global free trade, China can become the new leader. But look at this graph, and you know that it is not going to happen, because globalization has been driven by U.S. demand very much, that also U.S. capital export. So if U.S. really withdraw from the global economy with all this tariff and protectionist measure, then we lost the so-called the consumer of last resort. And China, everybody else is exporting stuff. That if U.S. as a huge consumer really withdraw from the global economy, then to where these exporters are exporting their stuff to? Then so China will never be a kind of a leader of globalization in the way that U.S. has been, unless China open up its market for foreign goods coming into China market. But China has been, under the state capitalist system, is doing the opposite, that becoming more and more protectionist and protecting its own enterprise. So it is not going to happen. So when U.S. withdraw from the global free trade structures, that we are not going to see in any time soon kind of alternative globalization led by China, but we will see a fragmentation of the global economy. And so it is globalization that U.S. has been driving it, and the democratization project U.S. has been driving it. And over the 1990s, of course, things getting darker and darker when the original Francis Fukuyama prediction that everybody will peacefully converge into liberal democracy and free market didn't work out that way, and then we have got a lot of troubles in terms of genocide and terrorism over the 1990s, and then U.S. Realized that to promote democracy and also global free trade, then U.S. Over the 1990s and early 2000s, definitely after 9/11, U.S. need to resort more and more to military intervention to establish this or to stabilize this order. And many people will point to 9/11 and then the war on Afghanistan and Iraq as the turning point of this U.S. militaristic neo-conservative doctrine of establishing democracy through military means. But actually, I don't think the Iraq war and Afghanistan war is the first, and actually the Kosovo war and the NATO bombing of Belgrade is the first time that U.S. actually and its NATO allies are involved in this militaristic action to safeguard democracies and fix conflicts. So it is this the whole edifice of a kind of American empire without a value judgment on the word empire, because in 2000s there's a lot of IR books and political science book talking about American imperialism, American empire, and Max book and Bill Kristol, all these neo-conservatives are talking about U.S. as a reluctant imperialist and an empire for good. So there's a lot of this talk. And how does China fit into this? My argument is that actually there are two foundations of this American Inter-Imperial project at the turn of the 21st century, and the so-called Trimerica, as coined by Leo Ferguson, is one foundation of it. And another foundation is Saudi Arabia, but I don't have time to talk about it. It has been since the 70s. But the Trimerica, that is this China-US economic union, through free trade is very important because the US, through this, at some brief moment in the Clinton administration, US maintained budget balance, but after a short while, the budget deficit exploded again, and at the early 2000s, because of all the military actions in Central and West Asia, that U.S. deficit exploded, and the U.S. solution to fix this deficit is, of course, that this Federal Reserve create more and more money, and then to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, and it is later known as quantitative easing. But China came into the picture because China, as a kind of an export-oriented economy, got a lot of U.S. dollar by exporting goods to the U.S., and then so the Chinese government accumulated a huge amount of U.S. dollar that it has many other places to invest in other than U.S. Treasury bonds. So in the end, this game of U.S. Federal Reserve create a lot of real liquidity and money, and then go to China, and then flow back to become the Chinese purchase of U.S. Treasury bond. So it is all the same as the quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, that in the late Obama period, that is Federal Reserve create money to directly buy U.S. Treasury bond, but with the intermediation of China, that U.S. money flow to China and flow back to the U.S. Treasury bond, and in the way that U.S. rake in a huge amount of Chinese manufactured products at the same time. And the other circuit is through Saudi Arabia and all the oil exporter. That so it is how the whole the U.S. Democracy and promotion and globalization project is supported in a large part by the Chinese export-oriented economy and this so-called Trimerica arrangement. So it is the New World Order at its height, but of course, and it saved me a lot of time. I don't need to elaborate because we already discussed it in the morning about this turning point of 2008. That China has been playing this game and in this kind of Trimerica arrangement diligently and without any doubt until 2008, that all of a sudden that the U.S. seemed to be in big trouble, and there's a lot of talk about that U.S. dollar is going to be lumbered, and then in 2009, 2010, China's stimulus project seems to be succeeding, and China become the new driving force of the global economy, and Brazil, Australia, and all these commodities exporter, and Canada became big beneficiary of this China growth and stimulus. Then the China thinking and the leadership thinking changed drastically, and thinking that it is their time to actually get out of this Trimerica and supporting the U.S. Foreign policy goals, and then to start to expand its own spheres of influence. And then in 2010, 2011, China internally started this kind of 国进民退 and all these kind of state enterprises expand at the expense of foreign enterprise and private enterprise. And at the same time, Xi Jinping came to power, and then the Belt and Road Initiative started. So besides investing this US dollar that China earned by exporting into US Treasury bond, now they find a apparent new way to use this US dollar, that is to lend money to these other developing countries and in Belt and Road country and so on and so forth. And so it turned out to be maybe a misjudgment, as we discussed in the morning, but actually it is the reality that China become ambitious again to take on the U.S. because when China export its capital to the Belt and Road country and expand its spheres of influence, it start to clash head-on with U.S. interests and spheres of influence among these U.S. traditional allies like Malaysia and Pakistan, definitely. So now we are ending up in a situation of uncertainty that by ending, I would urge everybody to read them properly. That I'm the only one who read that nowadays. That is the Lenin, Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And many people assume that it's just about colonies and colonialism, but actually it's very interesting. I understand Belt and Road and understand the US-China competition over these infrastructures, loan and lending. Actually, that this piece by Lenin is very, very useful because a large chunk of the text, Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, is not about formal colonies. It's about the Greek powers' competition to lend money to Brazil and other Latin American countries to finance their construction of railroad in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it is a kind of a competition among these capital surplus exporter. They are lending money to these late-coming countries, and if, for example, UK monopolized the financing of the Brazilian railroad, and Brazilian railroad construction will, in the procurement, that they will buy UK products and UK equipment and so on and so forth. And it created a kind of a competition and economic rivalry among this Greek power. First, economic and financial competition, and then it can escalate into military confrontation. And as you know, that Lenin is writing this book to explain the origins of the First World War. So now we are in this situation that it seems that we are coming back to the early 20th century. So whether it is leading to an escalation into a world war or regional conflict, or we can find out some way to create a kind of a more multilateral, a new multilateral arrangement to accommodate these new and old powers, then it is still too early to say. So I restrain myself from making any pessimistic or optimistic note, but keep it open for us to think about and discuss. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.